Out here, silence isn't absence. It's clarity. Most mornings I wake to the sound of pine needles brushing the tin roof of my cabin. If the wind is light, the air smells like soil and cedar. If it's strong, I can hear the groan of the trees as they lean into each other like old friends weathering another season. It's not loud, but it's never quiet in the way city dwellers imagine quiet to be. There's always something moving, something breathing. It's been almost 6 years since I left Oklahoma for good. I built this off-grid cabin near Boulder, Colorado with solar panels, reclaimed wood, and the stubborn belief that people could live more responsibly if they just tried. It was meant to be a temporary escape. Now it's the only place where I don't have to explain myself. My name is Rachel Moore. I'm 34, I'm an environmental scientist, and apparently I'm no longer welcome at my brother's wedding. The call came in the middle of a roof repair. Spring rain had warped one of the gutters, and I was balancing on a ladder wrist-deep in pine sludge when my phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I almost ignored it. But something curiosity maybe made me check. I hadn't heard from Aaron in a long time, not since he texted me a year ago asking if I'd stop posting about fossil fuel subsidies because Mom and Dad were getting questions at church. When I saw his name, I hesitated. I already knew. Instinct can be cruel like that, always a step ahead of confirmation. I answered, listened, and didn't say much. Just nodded, just breathed. He spoke with hesitation, then conviction. Something about the wedding being small, about Sarah's family wanting to keep things comfortable, about how my work was important but also a lot, and maybe it would be best if I just sat this one out. I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I didn't ask what part of me made them uncomfortable. The science, the politics, the part where I said things out loud that no one else wanted to acknowledge. I just listened. And when he was done, I said, "Thanks for calling," and hung up. Afterward, I went back to fixing the gutter. There's something grounding about labor when your mind is storming. By the time the pipe was reattached and sealed, the sky had shifted from pale gray to soft gold, and my hands were steady again. That evening, I sat in my usual chair by the window, cradling a warm mug of peppermint tea, watching the last bit of snow melt from the tree line. My cabin isn't big, just a single-room space with high ceilings and a loft bed, but it holds everything I need: books on climate models, a battered laptop, a water filtration system I built myself, no television, no distractions, just work wood and time. Sometimes I wonder if I disappeared, who would notice first? My neighbors are seasonal hikers. My colleagues work remotely. My parents haven't called in months. Maybe my editor at Green Verge, who expects an article every other Friday, would send a follow-up email. I'm not lonely. I just live on the other side of expectations. Growing up, I was the questioning child, the one who asked why we used so much pesticide, why the church taught submission over discussion, why girls had to wear skirts to dinner. My mother used to say, "Rachel, you were born with your arms crossed." I think she meant it as a joke, but sometimes it sounded like a wound she never healed from. My brother Aaron was the easy one. Football, church camp, good grades, and good timing. He knew how to nod without fully agreeing, how to slip past confrontation with a smile. I envied that once. I don't anymore. I used to think that distance from family was something tragic. But lately I've started to believe that distance, chosen honest distance, is a kind of love, the kind that doesn't demand change but doesn't accept erasure either. I spent that night sorting through old letters. Not the kind you send, but the ones you write just to breathe. I have a shoebox full of them. Letters to my mother I never mailed. Drafts of emails to my father that never got finished. A few crumpled pages addressed to no one in particular, just raw reflections written in moments like this. One read, "I wish you'd be proud of me without needing to understand me. I wish my silence wasn't the only version of peace you were willing to accept." I folded the letter back into the box and slid it beneath the bed. Outside, the wind had picked up. I watched the trees sway in slow rhythm. They moved freely, even when rooted. The next morning, I packed a small bag. I didn't know where I was going yet, only that staying put felt like conceding something I hadn't agreed to. I opened my laptop and stared at a map. Boston came to mind first, MIT, where I had once walked through rain-slicked streets with a backpack full of equations and doubts. I remembered Margaret, my advisor, who told me, "You think in systems." That's a gift most people spend their whole lives resisting. I checked her contact info. Still active. I started building a route Boston, Arizona, maybe even Oklahoma, not to return home, but to pass through it on my own terms, as a traveler, not as a daughter. I didn't tell anyone. I left a note on the cabin door for the delivery guy in case my solar panels shipped early. I locked the place, loaded up my dusty hybrid SUV, and pulled onto the dirt road as the morning light began climbing over the mountains. No music, just the hum of the engine and the faint rhythm of tires on gravel. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't running away. I was just going. Boston always made me feel like I was walking inside a mind larger than mine. Even now, years after I left the city, hadn't lost that sense of contained intensity, the old bricks of the academic buildings stacked tightly against new glass towers, students moving with that determined speed only found in places that run on intellect and ambition. I arrived in the late afternoon. The air was brisk, but the sun was strong enough to make the sidewalks shimmer. Spring in Boston doesn't arrive gently, it pushes itself in all at once. Tulips burst from the edges of campus paths. Bicycles reappear like long-lost pets. Everything wakes up at once. Walking past the gates of MIT again felt like slipping into a version of myself I hadn't seen in years. I remembered the first time I stood on these steps, backpack too heavy for my shoulders, notebook full of questions I didn't yet know how to ask. Back then, I believed that if I could understand enough, explain enough, prove enough, then maybe the world would make space for someone like me. It was here that I met Dr. Margaret Fields. She was the first adult who didn't flinch when I spoke with too much certainty. The first person who didn't warn me to be less intense, less serious, less everything. She taught me that rigor wasn't cold, it was care. That systems weren't abstract, they were personal. That science wasn't neutral, it was a language for justice if you used it that way. Her office was still in the same corner of the new sustainability building. The halls smelled like ozone and whiteboard markers. I didn't knock. I just stood for a moment outside the door, listening to the rustle of pages and the tap of keys inside, and then kept walking. There was something about returning to the places that made you, that reminded you what still mattered. That night I sat alone in the small university cafe across from the library. The windows faced west, and I watched the light retreat across the city like a tide. The coffee was terrible but familiar. At a nearby table, two students were arguing over whether geoengineering was ethical. One kept gesturing with a pencil, the other flipping through a journal article. Their voices blurred into background noise like distant radio chatter. I remembered being like that urgent, idealistic, convinced that if you just said it right, the world would listen. But the world doesn't always listen, especially not when it looks like you and expects you to stay quiet. I thought of my parents again. Of Aaron, of Sarah's family and their discomfort. I thought of how it had never been what I said that upset them. It was that I said anything at all. There's a particular ache that comes from being asked to disappear politely. I stayed at a quiet inn near the Charles River that night. My room overlooked a row of still leafless trees and a narrow stretch of water that shimmered under moonlight. The walls were thin. I could hear the faint sound of a cello being practiced in a neighboring room, slow, deliberate notes unsure of their next move. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought of the question I'd never asked Margaret. What do you do when your knowledge takes you further and further from the people you love? Not because they aren't smart, but because they've chosen a different kind of truth, one that doesn't stretch, doesn't bend, one that stays wrapped in comfort and familiarity. Maybe that was why I'd come here, not for answers, but to remember how it felt to be brave in thought without apology. To remind myself that I had once belonged to something, even if that something wasn't a person or a family or a home. I had belonged to an idea. And maybe I still did. The next morning I walked the river trail as the city stirred awake. Rowers sliced through the water with clean, synchronized rhythm. The air was damp, tinged with the scent of silt and cold stone. I sat on a bench with my travel notebook and a pen I hadn't used in months. For a long time, I just watched the water. Then I wrote one sentence: belonging isn't about being understood. It's about standing somewhere you don't have to explain why you're there. I tore the page out and folded it into my pocket. Just before I checked out of the inn, I opened my phone for the first time in hours. There was a message waiting. From an old neighbor back in Oklahoma, big wildfire spreading near the West Fields. Thought you should know. Looks like it might hit your family's property. No word from Aaron. No call from my parents. Just this quiet factual from someone who didn't owe me anything. I stood by the window for a long time watching the river flow east. Part of me wanted to delete the message. To keep moving west toward Arizona, toward somewhere dry and clear where the past didn't feel like it could catch fire and follow you. But another part, the deeper, quieter part, understood something else entirely. Some fires you don't run from, not to save what hurt you, but to save what still lives beneath it. Somewhere outside Flagstaff, Arizona, the sky bleeds in colors I don't see in Colorado. Reds that feel raw, oranges that feel earned. Not the polished kind you find in sunsets on postcards, but the ones shaped by dust and drought and old land holding its breath. The kind of color that reminds you fire isn't always destruction, it's memory. I had pulled off the highway just after mile marker 284, the place where the horizon opens into Pine Plateau and the forest thins into grassland. It's also where the cell signal came back and the wildfire alert buzzed through my phone again, urgent and color-coded red. The message was brief. Western Oklahoma, wind-driven, uncontained. That was home. And though no one had called me, I knew what that meant. I spent the night in a small town on the edge of the Coconino National Forest, the kind of place where the gas station sells hot burritos and wildfire maps. The motel smelled like lemon cleaner and old windows, and the walls were covered with flyers about evacuation drills, volunteer shifts, and a fire prevention seminar that was already 2 weeks too late. I didn't sleep much. Outside my window, the trees swayed hard against the wind. Gusts pushed dry leaves along the curb like whispers with nowhere left to go. I lay there staring at the ceiling fan spinning in tired circles, trying to convince myself that I didn't owe them anything, that I could keep driving west, that I wasn't the only one who knew how to calculate fire lines or read wind patterns or manage resource coordination. But there was a voice inside me I couldn't shut off, the one that always showed up when something needed fixing. It didn't sound like guilt. It sounded like responsibility without permission. In the morning, I drove out to the Wildfire Command Center south of town. The volunteers were already up pulling hoses, loading water tanks onto trucks, reviewing satellite images under a pop-up tent. Some were part-time firefighters. Others were just locals who didn't want to watch their land vanish. I had been here before. Not here exactly, but in this kind of scene, organized urgency, held together by zip ties and caffeine and a fragile sense of timing. I stayed on the sidelines for a while watching. No one recognized me. No one asked me who I was. And for a moment I liked that. I liked being just a woman with work boots and a wind-chapped face standing on dry earth with too much information in her head. Eventually I stepped forward and offered to help with the terrain modeling. A younger guy, a recent grad, maybe looked at me skeptically until I pulled up my old fire mitigation project portfolio from the USDA archives. The moment he saw my name next to a post-burn recovery framework used in Northern California, his tone changed. It always amazed me how quickly credentials could make someone visible. We spent the next 4 hours mapping potential ignition zones and calculating likely spread vectors based on topography, fuel load, and wind speeds. It was all muscle memory at this point, math and instinct, risk and breath. But my hands weren't shaking because of the fire in Arizona. They were shaking because of the fire back in Oklahoma, because I could picture the place. Not just the dry fields and the thinning grass, and the way wind moved like an animal across the plains, but the house itself. My father's old barn with its leaning roof, the kitchen window where my mother used to hang dish towels with floral prints, the back porch where Aaron and I once caught fireflies in glass jars, back when we thought light could be owned. I hadn't stepped foot on that land in over 5 years, and yet I still knew the grid layout better than I knew my own heartbeat. By afternoon, the Arizona teams had their action plan and I was no longer needed. I sat in my car, hands on the steering wheel, staring out at the line of clouds building over the horizon. The wind was stronger now, gusts lifting dirt into spirals on the highway shoulder. I opened the weather app again. The fire in western Oklahoma had reached level 3 emergency status. My family's land sat right on the edge of the predicted path. There was still time. I didn't make the decision like a hero. There was no music, no revelation, no dramatic monologue. It was quieter than that. More like stepping into cold water inch by inch until your breath catches and the body simply adapts. I didn't call home. I didn't write a message. I just entered the coordinates into my GPS, turned the key, and started driving east. Not because they'd asked, not because they deserved it, but because I knew how to help, and helping wasn't something I unlearned just because it stopped being appreciated. Somewhere near Gallup, New Mexico, the highway stretched wide and flat, the kind of road where the land makes no apology for how endless it is. I drove with the windows half down, letting the wind remind me I was still real. I thought of all the things my parents never asked me. They never asked what I did when I spent months in burned forests helping rebuild what was lost. They never asked how it felt to be the only woman on a logistics crew working 12-hour shifts under ash-thick skies. They never asked if it changed me. They just assumed I'd wandered too far. And maybe I had. But the truth was, I didn't come back for them. I came back for the land. For the pieces of place that shaped me before the judgment did. For the stretch of field behind the barn where the soil still held the memory of roots planted generations ago. I came back because fire doesn't care about who's right, it only asks who's ready. The first thing I noticed was the sky, not the fire. Not the fields, not the house, just the sky burned into a strange orange-gray like dusk had arrived too early and brought with it the color of endings. I parked my car a few hundred yards from the property line. Emergency crews had blocked off most of the back roads. I took the rest on foot gear bag over my shoulder boots, sinking into dry grass and soft ash. The wind carried a bitter smell pine plastic and the slow unraveling of something no longer whole. The land looked both familiar and foreign. There was the outline of the house I'd grown up in, half obscured by smoke, the red barn to the east sagging more than I remembered, the big oak tree by the front fence still standing somehow untouched, though everything around it had been stripped to a nervous silence. I hadn't been here in years, and yet my body remembered the distance between each building, the soft slope of the driveway, the exact way the gravel used to crunch under the tires of my father's old pickup. It was a memory both tender and distant, like watching someone else's childhood from behind glass. Fire doesn't ask for permission. It crawls. It leaps. It feeds on chance. The western edge of my parents' land had already blackened. The brush was gone, the fence line burned down to glowing metal posts. A small utility shed near the back had collapsed into its own foundation wood, and wire melted into something unrecognizable. I reached the staging area where local responders were gathered, coordinating water lines, reviewing terrain models. Their faces were drawn, their uniforms streaked with sweat and soot. I walked in quietly, offered what I knew, credentials first, method second. They handed me a copy of the latest burn map, and I traced the line of the advancing front with a fingertip I didn't realize was shaking. The wind had shifted southeast. The main house was now directly in its path. No one said anything when I approached the porch, not the officer standing by the gate, not the neighbor from 2 farms down who looked at me with the vague familiarity of someone trying to place a face they hadn't seen since graduation, and not my father who stood just outside the front door, arms crossed, jaw set. His eyes met mine for half a second, then drifted away like we were 2 strangers accidentally colliding on a sidewalk. My mother was inside, I assumed. The curtains were drawn. The front light flickered unsteady. There were no words exchanged. None needed. The ground beneath our silence said enough. I moved quickly. The solar inverter near the garage had been damaged, and the line feeding into the main water pump was exposed. If it caught, they'd lose both pressure and backup reserves. I flagged the fire crew, explained the pressure drop risk, pointed out the break line on the terrain map, and helped them reroute the suppression foam trench. They followed without question, not because I raised my voice, but because I spoke like someone who'd done this before. There's a tone that comes with practiced urgency. It cuts through pride. But still, no one from the house came out. Not my mother, not Aaron, just smoke. Then the flash came. A sharp, blue-white pulse across the tree line. I knew instantly what it was. The transformer. It had gone. The explosion wasn't large, but it was enough. A jolt of sound, a plume of white, then a small fire skittering toward the north pasture, pushed by wind like breath on a match. I didn't think. My body just moved. I grabbed the nearest foam line, adjusted the nozzle, and sprinted toward the fence line. Another crew member met me halfway, and without speaking, we worked shoulder to shoulder, knee-deep in soot and heat, forming a containment ring before the flame could leap the last 30 feet to the tool shed and take the house with it. My gloves melted in patches. My throat scratched from the air. My heart thudded not from fear, but from the strange calm that sometimes comes when you're exactly where you're needed, exactly where no one expected you to be. By nightfall, the worst had passed. The fire had been redirected to open ground on the east side. The house was still standing, the barn mostly untouched, a few vehicles damaged, a few trees lost, but the land for now had survived. I sat on a bench outside the barn, helmet in my lap boots caked in soot. My back ached, my fingers pulsed with exhaustion, and still no one came to say anything. The front porch remained lit but empty, windows dark, curtains closed. At some point, I went into the kitchen to refill my canteen. The door was unlocked. The house smelled like cedar cleaner and old toast. It hadn't changed. Same tile floor, same chipped countertop, same magnet on the fridge. Faith is not knowing what the future holds, but knowing who holds the future. I poured water into my bottle. On the table, there was a folded piece of lined paper with my name on it. I opened it. Thank you. No signature. No pretense. Just those 2 words in my mother's handwriting. I held the paper for a moment, then tucked it into my bag. I didn't feel relief, or anger, or sadness. I just felt done. Before leaving, I walked one last time through the field behind the barn. The soil was scorched, but not dead. I knelt, pressed my fingers into the ash, and felt the heat still humming beneath the surface. The land would recover, slowly, quietly, just like I had. When I returned to Boulder, the mountains were still there, unchanged and patient. The snowcaps had thinned into gray streaks. The air was warmer, but not warm, just enough to leave the windows cracked, just enough to make you think about what's next. I pulled into my driveway just past noon. The cabin looked like I'd never left. Clean lines, solar panels, intact front porch, swept clear by the wind. My neighbor had gathered the mail into a neat stack inside a weatherproof box. A few pine cones had landed on the steps like a quiet welcome. Everything was waiting exactly as I'd left it, and somehow I was not. Inside, I dropped my duffel near the door and stood still for a long time. The silence wasn't heavy. It was familiar, like stepping into your own breath again after holding it too long. I brewed coffee, black, strong. Then I opened the windows wide. The trees swayed gently. The filtered light slipped through like a benediction. Later that afternoon, I checked my inbox. Mostly newsletters, automated updates, and one message from the reforestation team I'd spoken with a few months ago. They were launching a new project, micro-forest plots in low-income communities across Colorado, and they wanted me to lead the Boulder chapter. I didn't hesitate. I replied yes, because something inside me had shifted. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but like a river carving a new bend after years of pressure, quiet and certain. In the days that followed, I found a rhythm again. Early mornings clearing brush, site assessments for native species, Zoom calls with local volunteers who wore tie-dye shirts and spoke with the same urgency I used to feel in grad school. And every now and then, in between shovels and spreadsheets, I caught myself smiling, not because things were perfect, but because I no longer needed them to be. I received a message from Aaron a few days later. No greeting, no apology. Hey, you okay? That was all. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He was reaching, perhaps, but without the hands to hold what reaching meant. That wasn't cruelty. That was habit. And I had stopped bending toward habit. One evening, while walking the ridge behind my cabin, I passed a new pine sapling, small, bright green, stubbornly alive. I knelt beside it, pressed my hand to the dirt, and felt the cool damp beneath the surface. A thought came to me, clear and uninvited. I never needed to go home to be whole. I had gone back not to reclaim something, but to release it. To return not as a daughter seeking repair, but as a witness to what could not be undone and what didn't need to be. The house still stood. The land still smoked. The people still didn't say much, but I had said something with my presence, and sometimes that's enough. I wrote a letter to my mother a week later, not out of obligation, not as a peace offering, just because I had something to say. I don't hate you. I never did. I just couldn't keep shrinking myself to fit the shape of someone else's comfort. I've built something here. Not a life you'd recognize, but one I recognize every morning. I wish you peace, even if it's from a distance. Rachel. I didn't sign it with love. I didn't send it. I folded it once, slid it into the drawer beside my bed, and left it there. Some words are meant to be written more than read. Weeks passed. The microforest project began taking shape. Teenagers from the high school showed up with work gloves too big for their hands. An elderly woman from the reservation brought seeds she'd kept for years. The soil was stubborn, but so were we. One morning during a break, a young volunteer asked if I had family nearby. I paused, then said simply, "No, but I've got good neighbors." And that was the truth. That spring, I replaced the photo on my nightstand. It used to be a faded picture of me and Aaron in the front yard catching fireflies frozen mid-laugh. I had kept it out of loyalty to a memory, not because it brought me joy. Now I replaced it with a photo of the reforestation team planting the first sapling, muddy hands, wide smiles, messy hair. People who didn't know my past but chose me anyway. Chosen family, not inherited. Built, not assigned. On the last night of May, I sat on the porch with a cup of ginger tea. The sky was deep blue, soft at the edges. Wind moved through the trees like breath. There were no texts, no calls, no unfinished questions hovering above me. Just stillness, not absence, not silence, stillness. And I realized the distance between me and them never disappeared, but I stopped measuring it, because now I know where I stand, and that is enough. I don't know if anyone out there has ever felt this, the kind of return that isn't about reconnection, but about clarity. Coming back not to reopen something, but to understand why it had to close. I used to think forgiveness required a conversation, a reckoning, maybe even tears. But I've learned that some silences don't need explanations. Some doors stay closed, not out of anger, but because the waiting is over. I used to be the daughter who was too much. Now I'm a woman who stands with herself. I didn't go back to be welcomed. I went back to protect a piece of land that shaped me, even if the people on it never truly saw me. I don't need their approval to exist. I just need to know that I no longer ask permission to be who I am. If you've ever felt small in your own family, hear this. You're not alone, and you are not broken for needing distance. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away just far enough to finally breathe in your own name. So if someone were to ask me today, do you have family? I'd smile and say, not in the way most people mean. But I have people who listen. I have a home I built with my own hands, and I have peace no one can take from me. Because here's the truth, choosing yourself isn't selfish, setting boundaries isn't cold, and walking away from what erases you, that's not weakness, that's wisdom. Some of us weren't meant to belong quietly. We were meant to stand fully honestly, even if it makes others uncomfortable. So if you're caught between loyalty and self-respect right now, I hope Rachel's story reminds you, it's okay to stop shrinking. It's okay to outgrow what doesn't see you. What do you think? Have you ever walked away from a version of family to protect your voice? Leave a comment below. Because your story, yes, yours might be the light someone else needs when they're walking the same quiet road. And if this story touched something in you, follow the channel. There are more stories waiting. Not always easy ones, but real ones. For people like us.